Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Combinate podcast. I'm your host, Subi Sadeh. On this episode, I was joined by Leo Eisner, who's the founder of Eisner Safety Consultants. He's also known as the IEC 60601 guy. In this episode, Leo discusses the complexities involved with assessing the applicability of standards to medical device and combination products. Leo delves into the importance of understanding product environment, intended use, and market specifics. He also highlights challenges and strategies for documenting standards assessments. He emphasizes the importance of leveraging existing standards to avoid unnecessary characterization and development. This episode also covers tips for small and big companies, the significance of early research, and the essential stakeholders involved in standards assessments. If you're not already subscribed to the show, please subscribe, hit the like button, and give it 5 stars on whatever platform you're listening on. And without further ado, here is Leo.
Hello, Combi Nation. My name is Subi Sadeh. I've spent over a decade in medical device, pharma, and combination product development. Our industry feels complicated sometimes. Drugs, devices, clinical trials, submissions, sterilization, validation, design control, risk management, market access, reimbursement. The list goes on. My goal is mastery, so this podcast is to ask questions I have to people who may have the answers. Each week on the Combinate podcast, I talk to someone about their area to further understand and simplify. Whether you're a pharma person trying to understand the next wave of products, or a device person trying to navigate a pharma system you're unfamiliar with, or a newbie in both areas, I invite you to listen, and together we can simplify by combinating.
I wanted to talk about a topic that I think every project team struggles with in some ways, and that is, how do we assess standards applicability? Now, I know that you're involved in IEC standards and you've done a lot of work in the standards making, but this is looking at it from the other perspective, not so much making the standards, but more assessing for application. So first off, when you're I'll just say, how do you typically deal with standards that you're not a part of?
So the first thing we do with almost every client we work with is we ask a lot of questions. So the first thing we do is we want to understand their product as best as we can. The environment it's used in makes a big difference because how it's applied and used affects what parts of certain standards apply. Classification in 60601 specifically, and other standards have, depending how they're written, might apply differently if you use an active element of the device versus a non-active element of the device, or if it's sterile or non-sterile, or if it's cleanable. So knowing those details are going to help decide what parts of a standard apply. Also, how it's going to be marked or labeled or packaged, or the labeling on the packaging, the environmental conditions, the operating conditions. So knowing those details from your product specs would be one good source, obviously. So some of the things we do is, what does it do? How does it interact with users or patients? What's the intended use, indications for use? Another thing that's really important on the design aspect is, what are the markets it's going into? Because different countries might have deviations to the same standard. So like in the 601 series, if you look at the US versus Canada, you have slightly different requirements. Because in Canada, there's one province that requires French marking, for example.
Now, into the standards assessment. So you talked about asking a lot of questions. If you were on a project team, new project team, and you have a device design concept, one of the outside of what the user needs out of the device, one thing that's always grounding your design is the landscape that you're working with as defined by the existing standards, what 14971 calls state of the art. How do you go about assessing what that what the current state is.
So basically, reviewing what's out there and finding the most current version of the standard of whatever that standard is. Now, I always look towards the scope of the standard to make sure I fit in that standard. But sometimes there are some products that don't fit in specific standards, but have a slice of a standard that still will apply. And I still look at the scope to understand, is there any aspect that may apply to me that I still may apply, but not fully evaluate?
Yeah, I can. There was one time I worked on a device that was not a closed system transfer device, which would typically be a standalone medical device. It was it had some elements that would be considered maybe, but it definitely was not a CSTD in the sense of the standard definition. But we did use some of the clauses for our functional testing because we didn't want to reinvent the wheel on what the acceptance criteria, the method was, etc. And so that's an example. I know that as far as how common are those? I've seen it a few times in my career where we've had to do that, where it's okay that we're not an infusion pump, we're not a IV bag, we're not a whatever. But man, this we have a spike connector, we have this element that is defined in those standards and could be used by our use case. And so that's what we're going to tie our chain to.
Yeah, we see it probably, I don't know, I would gander a guess of 15-25% of our projects.
Yeah.
And that's a wild guess, obviously. And
Yeah. No,
it's not a,
I think that's pretty significant. In other words, I think the point that you're getting at is just because there's no sometimes you have an NF1 product or you have one competitor and you need to understand what maybe your competition is doing from a state of the art point of view. But if there are other products that have similar functions, then it stands to reason that you may be able to piecemeal some of those functions and use, even though it's not a technical requirement for. What does it look like in terms of it sound I think you were gonna it sounds like you were gonna say
I
something.
was just going to leverage from what you said a little earlier about using requirements, even if they're not a full standard, and leveraging is a really good thing to do because if you have, if it's a consensus standard, like through FDA or a state of the art standard for MDR, that's something better than creating the wheel by yourself, which then you're going to have to prove to whatever regulator, which is going to be a big uphill battle.
So talk to me about documentation. How do you go about I think this is where this is an area of I think a little bit of anxiety for some of the projects that I've been on, particularly the ones that I was on the R&D side where I was responsible for going in and doing this activity because going in and looking at standards is into a department store with no shopping list. It's there's so many and you're not worried about making sure that you got the right ones. The thought that's always in the back of your head is like, "Oh, did I miss one? Is there some obscure clause that I may have glazed over or that maybe a scope that is because at least in the combination product space, that may not be as cut and dry. And so sometimes the terminology may not be clear to somebody who's a layperson or a lay user. But I'm just wondering, talk to me about documentation. Where is it, do you typically document a standards assessment as part of an existing design history file document? Is it something that's done informally and then integrated later on when once you have more formal requirements set up?
We try to put the standards that are required into the sign input documents, into the product requirements, into the label requirements document, and show in the mitigations for the hazard analysis what standards you use for testing, as an example, or will use. So you have the traceability. And then you break down within the standard, okay, this clause applies because I know these three elements about the product. This applies. This doesn't apply because I know these other issues about the product, or it doesn't exist for this product. So these couple clauses don't apply. One thing that fourth edition of 60601 is trying to do that currently 601 doesn't do very well is trying to make the requirements atomic. So when you as a manufacturer want to have a product requirement and have one requirement per subclause, because you're going to have details that break down depending what level you're at of subclause, you'll be able to get a requirement that you can then from a database standard extract out and put right into your design requirements. We're trying to make it that you can extract from the standard and just put it in your design requirements in the future.
Could you go a little bit deeper on the making requirements atomic?
So right now, a lot of the requirements are there might be multiple requirements in a subclause, and it gets very jumbled and very hard to read the requirement. So you might have three sets of requirements, and then the conformity check says check all this, and it should show in the risk management file. But you're trying to confirm the requirements of three different things instead of one specific item. It gets messy. And then in some sections, the requirements could go on for multiple paragraphs that are pages long. Just it's really messy now.
And so
And so
what
we're
you're
trying to clean it up and make it easier to digest and much more clean that it'll be easier to understand, even
so
if it's
section 4.1.14 is one requirement. Yes, no, do you meet it? Versus in the current
or
version,
you
it's
in
check
this
for A through E.
well, we still may have A through
Mm.
E, but that's still one requirement, whatever the A through E might be,
Mm.
because we will have lists still.
So I think where what I want to move to is projects typically follow a stage gate process, right? I'm sure
Yep.
many of the clients that you've worked on have had 4 or 5 stage gates before going into commercial. Let's use the example of concept, planning, feasibility, design output, design input, design output, and design verification, and commercial pre-launch as 4. Putting in the of it's always good to start as early as possible, getting that out of the way. When would you typically start? Because I know every consultant in the world always says that, but like, when would you actually document a standards assessment? Is it in concept phase? Because I always think that's ideal, but where teams struggle to do that is where do I put it? Because I don't have product requirements yet. I just have a concept.
And a lot of times that concept, you don't have a QMS set up either.
Sure.
And if you don't have a QMS, you can't document it properly. So I would say at the very beginning of design input would be where I would probably go. If you could do it at the very end of concept, that'd be great, but it's probably very unrealistic.
How does this, you've worked at companies large and small, right? Most large companies are in the situation where they have a QMS. Is it different for those situations?
Sure. And smaller companies, they struggle. They don't have the resources, just to put it plain and blunt. Large companies also, they don't always have the SMEs that should be involved in helping decide or interpret what standards really apply based on the scope of the standards, I think. Because I think they're identified by a group that sometimes aren't understanding the total concept of the standard to really know, does the full scope of the standard apply? Does part of the scope standard apply, or how's it apply to our product based on the environment, the environmental conditions, the sterility, the electrical specs,
User.
the whatever specs apply.
Yeah. And so who are the right people to assess standards applicability?
Well, I think it really depends on the standard to some extent. Could be design engineers, R&D, a lot of times. There's going to be people that know biocompatibility and cleaning and sterilization. That's still on your design side, I assume. There's probably labeling experts. There's some, obviously, you need QMS aspects too. You're going to need UDI. There's a lot of labeling. There's also looking at applicable guidances, directives, laws, regulations that apply, and guidances, depending on the regulatory body, can go far afield.
Resilient.
Some are design aspects, some are quality aspect, some are other things that I couldn't even describe properly. You probably
Now,
know some more than me.
sure. I don't know about sure, but moving on, I'll
I
say.
think we know different things. That's all.
So there are situations where you have mature product areas, like maybe some of the ones where there are product specific. So IV parenteral containers or pre-filled syringes or infusion pumps or whatever, where there are standards for down to the here's how you do a certain infusion pump test. That's why the delivered volume, let's say. Is it different if you're working in a space where there are defined standards, and this is a question focused on documentation. Let's say I'm designing an IV bag. I think the IV bag standard is 15747, I believe. Do you go in? I know this is an area that I've worked in the past, but would you go in and document? I've gone in and checked for my product every single clause and document applicability, non-applicability. Like, because I think I guess what I'm hearing you say is during product requirements, if you have some bespoke, obscure device that's touching a few different standards but doesn't really fall into a category, you know that you have some element of whatever, let's say some characteristics that are defined in other standards that you can pull and pluck from. They would maybe help you establish your acceptance criteria, your test method, how you set up your fixtures, and so on. That would be really helpful. That's where in your PRD you would document this requirement, the source of the acceptance criteria is this standard, and so on and so forth. In other situations, you may be expected to be designing around an entire standard where there's a product specific one. And I'm wondering, this is all from a documentation perspective. Would you, if you were designing an IV container, like a IV bag, would you have a specific document that assesses the IV bag standard and says this clause applies to me, this one doesn't apply to me, this one applies to me, this one doesn't apply to me, and so on? I think everybody knows they need to assess standards. It's just not clear to what level and what documentation is required.
So if you look from a MDR perspective and probably even FDA perspective, it's should be in your technical documentation, whatever you want to call that between the two regulators, let's call it, that you can show evidence that you did an assessment somehow. So how you do that is going to be different by different organizations. But the easiest way, so for electrical 601 standards, most of them have what's called TRFs, test report forms, I think, that are already existing, that are through the CB scheme, which I
CB?
happen to be CB, conformity, I forget what the B stands for. It's through IEC. It's part of the IEC. There's like sister organizations, and those TRFs are checklists that are a summary of the requirements in the standard. They're not like the whole standard rewritten all over, but it's a checklist. And you can say, this applies, this doesn't apply. And if it applies, I pass this requirement. So the TRF is actually for the test lab or whoever's testing the equipment, because it's supposed to be agnostic to who's testing. If the
Uh-huh.
product passes for this requirement or this requirement, does it have the proper labeling? Did I pass the drop test? Did I pass the humidity test, the leakage test, the dielectric, mechanical, whatever? There's a whole bunch of mechanical tests, the temperature tests, etc. For another product like an IV container, I don't know that standard, so I can't speak to it very
I've
well,
never, we
obviously.
don't have TR. I haven't heard of a TRF with an ISO standard, but I'm looking at it and that's a real
Most
interesting.
ISO standards don't have them that I know of. I know we're talking, I believe in, I think it's 20417. We're talking about something like that. I think that's the standard we're talking about, that Scott Colburn was talking about, potentially having something within either within the standard or as a supplemental document, because that's information supplied by the manufacturer, is pretty much a global document that all medical device manufacturers really need to conform to.
And so having a checklist
Very helpful
would be a very
document.
helpful.
So
Um,
that I'm not sure if they're thinking through IMDRF or through ISO. I don't know that detail at this point.
as we move to close, Leo, broad brush thoughts on standards assessment. Everybody knows you got to do it. The how it's documented is the tough part.
Obviously, just as a reminder, know your product, its intended use, indications for use, the environments being used in, the environmental conditions, all the different conditions or product specs that are really going to be pertinent. Also, the markets, because that's going to affect your design. And you don't want to redesign the product. You want to try to design it one time. That's always easier. That we preach that to our clients all the time. Do your research early and think of different words for search terms, which we haven't talked about. There's different terms that are similar that you might key in on that find that standard that you didn't catch the first time around. Use the ISO online browsing platform. It's a really powerful tool to look for standards. IEC, you have something similar on their search bar for standards. Those are the more international, but you might also look at like CEN and CENELEC, AMI in the US, CAN, CSA for Canada. So you might look at the regionals and find stuff that you don't see in the international that might be what you need. BSI works on some really unique stuff occasionally.
I hadn't
Um,
actually, because this is that took a turn in a direction that I wasn't expecting, at least in my head, at least, because there is a lot of in terms of just how you document it. Because this has been something that I wish was a little bit clearer, and that there was at least some high level standardization. And I know that when it comes to literature search, there are some clear expectations about how you document it. Like you were saying, database, what keywords were used for what time frame, and so on. When was the search done? And I think that those kinds of things would be really well. Yeah, I think those might serve well in terms of doing a blanket kind of standards assessment. Here are the databases we looked at. Are there any regional ones? To your point, if you just had a flow that you had to go through and answer a bunch of questions before you got down to the list, and then similarly, when once you have the list, being able to go through each standard. I have not been I haven't seen a lot of emphasis put on systemizing this process, and I wish there was one. And I think what would be good, just having heard you say that, is step A is you do high level database search. Which database did you look at? When did you look at it? What keywords were used? Are there any regional? So on. Step two would be, okay, what is the list of standards? Who is the internal stakeholder that was responsible for assessing the standard and getting me back the requirements? And then those requirements go into your PRD review and design review done. That yeah, so that I think
Again, the
works.
breakdown is, yeah, definitely part of it. And also, sometimes you don't have the internal resource. Seek out good quality resources, vet them, make sure you vet them, whoever they are. I don't care if it's me or someone else. Make sure you get a good resource. I've had clients come to me after they've had a bad resource. And even though they came to me and we helped them get through like 20 pages of notified body comments, which is a reality that I hit once, which
Mm,
took 6 months for us to get through and retesting, etc. A year later, they closed their doors because they were too late to market, which is
mm,
horrible. I don't like that. That just bugs me to no end.
sure.
I'd rather, if they came to me earlier, I think they may not have closed, but I don't know that for a fact. Could have been funding issues too, for all I know.
Yeah.
But
Uh, where can people find you, Leo?
my website, eisnersafety.com, and on LinkedIn, of course,
Awesome.
where we
Well,
met, I think.
correct. Awesome having you on again, Leo. This was fun.
Yeah, always enjoy it.